The year was 1983, the kind of summer when families still packed coolers with sandwiches and cassette tapes rattled in the glove compartment. A modest car pulled out of a driveway in a quiet neighborhood, its roof rack carefully strapped with luggage, its windows reflecting a golden evening sun. Inside the car, voices overlapped, children laughing about the motel swimming pool they would soon see, a father promising to stop for ice cream along the way, a mother turning around to remind the youngest to fasten a seatbelt. It was a moment stitched with warmth and ordinariness, the kind of moment every family has, yet it was destined to become something people would replay endlessly in their minds. That drive out of the driveway was the last verifiable image of them alive. What makes disappearances so haunting is not only the silence that follows, but the way the ordinary becomes sacred in retrospect. A trunk crammed with suitcases once looked like nothing more than preparation for a trip. Later, it would be seen as a frozen artifact of a journey never completed. Neighbors who waved goodbye that morning would forever replay the sight of the car's taillights fading down the street, wondering if they should have noticed something, anything, that hinted at what was to come. The laughter inside that car, cheerful, almost impatient, was the final known music of their existence, and then it was replaced by something quieter, something that lingered over the town like fog. The early 80s had a distinct flavor of innocence. Families trusted the road, trusted each other, and trusted the idea that a holiday was exactly what it sounded like, a break, a reward after months of work or school. Across America, highways stretched like ribbons through forests and deserts, promising freedom. Billboards advertised roadside attractions, postcards were bought in gas stations, and families like this one believed that journeys were meant to bring people closer together. But this journey was different. The road that was meant to unite them ended up dissolving them into myth. When the family failed to return home, their absence was at first explained with reasonable assumptions. Perhaps the car had broken down. Perhaps they had extended their holiday. Friends reassured one another, and relatives held on to that optimism for a few days. Yet optimism has an expiration date, and as the first week passed, the unanswered calls, the unopened mailbox, and the silence of their house began to speak louder than any words could. Curtains hung still in the windows, the lawn grew untended, and the neighborhood felt the weight of something unspoken. The disappearance would eventually ignite police searches, media coverage, and rumors that spread like wildfire, but in this opening memory, what matters most is the fragile perfection of that last known moment. A car full of laughter, the hum of an engine, the sound of tires crunching against gravel as it rolled onto the open road. For them, it was the start of a holiday. For history, it was the opening scene of a story without an ending. Even decades later, people return to that moment with aching fascination. They imagine the father adjusting the mirror, the mother humming along to the radio, the children bickering over who got the window seat. It feels unbearably close, because it could be any family, it could be any drive. It was a moment both ordinary and monumental, suspended between the comfort of routine and the abyss of what followed. To begin their story is to begin with absence disguised as presence, with joy that history has turned into tragedy, with the haunting realization that the holiday that began that day has never truly ended. They were not a remarkable family in the sense that headlines usually demand. They lived in a modest home with a white-painted porch, the kind of place where bicycles leaned against the siding and a wind chime clinked softly in the evening breeze. What made them unforgettable was not wealth or scandal, but their ordinariness, the gentle, unassuming rhythm of their lives, the way each of them fit into the other's orbit. And it was precisely this ordinariness that would later sharpen the tragedy, because once they vanished, their absence tore a hole in the fabric of something so universally familiar, a family on holiday. The father, Richard, was 38, a man who approached the world with methodical care. He was the kind of man who checked the locks twice before bed, who folded maps with crisp precision, who liked the comfort of knowing routes before setting out. His work at a local insurance office rarely made him the center of attention, but colleagues described him as steady, a man who never raised his voice but whose presence calmed others. At home, his authority was quiet, wrapped in gestures rather than commands. He carried with him a habit of writing lists in small notebooks, lists of groceries, lists of chores, even lists of the cassette tapes they should bring for the drive. Those notebooks would later feel like artifacts, each page a window into a mind that sought order in a world that would soon unravel into chaos. The mother, Elaine, was a shade younger, 35, and possessed an optimism that made her the sun around which the family seemed to revolve. She worked part-time at a library, her hands often dusted with the scent of old pages. Neighbors remembered her as soft-spoken, the kind of woman who lent out sugar and remembered birthdays. Yet beneath her gentleness was resilience, a quiet strength that friends admired. She was the one who packed the sandwiches, who double-checked the children's suitcases, who planned the games to keep them entertained during the drive. She believed in small joys, stopping to pick wildflowers by the road, singing along to the radio even when the children groaned in protest. When Elaine disappeared, it wasn't only her physical absence that unsettled people, it was the vanishing of that warmth, the loss of someone who had stitched kindness into the seams of daily life. Their eldest child, Michael, was 12, standing at the edge of adolescence where childhood's innocence begins to thin. He was curious, fascinated with drawing maps, much like his father, but his maps contained monsters in the forests and treasure in the mountains. He carried a notebook filled with doodles and comic strip heroes, often shading them with the stub of a pencil until the paper nearly tore. Teachers remembered him as bright but restless, the kind of boy who asked questions faster than answers could come. On that holiday trip, he had begged to sit in the front seat, to feel like a grown-up, to be close to the radio where he could twist the dial. His voice, caught somewhere between boyhood and maturity, would be one of the last echoes neighbors recalled, his laughter spilling across the yard the night before the journey. Beside him was his sister, Anna, only 9, a child who still clung to stuffed animals and wore her hair in braids. She was quiet compared to her brother, but her silence carried depth. She loved books, much like her mother, and had an imagination that could spin entire worlds from a single story. Friends from school remembered how she created elaborate games during recess, assigning roles of kings and queens, turning a patch of grass into a kingdom. For the trip, she had packed her favorite paperback, its cover already worn from rereading, and she had promised to read aloud to her brother once he grew bored of the road. Photographs from that summer show her with a shy half-smile, as though she was already learning how to hold secrets, as though she carried within her an interior world no one could fully reach. The youngest, Daniel, was barely 6, a whirl of energy who seemed to leave a trail of laughter wherever he went. He had a fascination with toy cars, lining them up in long rows on the living room rug, imitating the sounds of engines. For him, the trip was less about destinations and more about the thrill of motion. His small backpack was filled with crayons, a coloring book, and the stuffed dog he refused to sleep without. In many ways, he was the soul of the family, the one who kept the others tethered to innocence. When people later spoke of the family, it was his absence that tightened their throats the most, because he had barely begun to live. Together, they were a constellation of personalities, steady father, hopeful mother, curious son, imaginative daughter, exuberant youngest child. Their lives overlapped in ways both messy and beautiful, like the overlapping voices during dinner, or the clutter of shoes by the front door, or the way their laughter often blended into a single sound. They were not perfect. There were arguments about bedtimes, forgotten homework, disagreements about money. Yet their imperfections were the kind that make a family real, the kind that endear rather than divide. As the date of their holiday approached, preparations filled the house with a sense of anticipation. Richard checked the car twice, making sure the tires were sound, the oil changed, the trunk space measured. Elaine packed lunches into neat foil-wrapped bundles, humming under her breath as she worked. Michael sketched imaginary maps of the places they would pass, Anna tucked her book into her small suitcase, and Daniel asked again and again how many hours until they left. It was a household vibrating with the simple joy of an upcoming journey, unaware that it would be remembered not as a beginning but as an end. When news of their disappearance later spread, it was these details people clung to. A colleague recalled Richard's steady handshake only days before. A neighbor remembered Elaine laughing on the porch. A classmate remembered Anna's quiet smile in the schoolyard. Another child remembered Michael showing him a half-finished comic sketch. And everyone remembered Daniel running barefoot across the lawn, his laughter carried on the evening air. These fragments, once ordinary, became sacred, replayed endlessly as if by preserving them in memory, people could somehow preserve the family themselves. They were a family like countless others, ordinary to the point of invisibility, until the day invisibility became literal. Their story did not begin with mystery, but with humanity. It began with a man who wrote lists, a woman who loved stories, children who dreamed of adventure. And perhaps that is why, even now, their absence feels unbearable, because they could have been anyone's family, and because in knowing them, even briefly, the loss becomes not just theirs, but ours. The hours after the family left their driveway remain the only hours anyone can speak of with certainty. Time has a way of distorting memory, but the timeline of those first steps into their journey has been pieced together with painstaking care, each sighting like a flickering candle in the dark. What's eerie is not only how ordinary those sightings were, but how quickly they stopped, as if the family had been steadily walking across a stage, only to vanish mid-step. The first confirmation came from their own neighbors, who recalled seeing the car roll out just after 8 in the morning. The family waved cheerfully through the windows. The father gave a short honk of the horn, the kind he always used as a friendly goodbye. For the neighbors, it was an image that seemed almost too banal to matter at the time, until days later, when investigators stood on the same curb, asking them to repeat the details again and again. What were they wearing? Did anyone else follow the car? Was there anything unusual? The neighbors shook their heads. It had been so very normal. Hours later, their vehicle was spotted at a toll booth along the highway. The operator remembered them because families stood out among the rush of commuters and truck drivers. The children were restless in the back, pressing their faces to the window, and the mother leaned forward as if to ask her husband something. The operator said the father had looked tired but not unhappy, the kind of tiredness common at the beginning of a long drive. This moment became another anchor in the map of their disappearance, proof that at least for this stretch of highway, they were still there, still together, still moving toward what was supposed to be a holiday destination. A little farther along, a tourist with a brand new camera inadvertently captured the family's car in the corner of a photograph. It was meant to be a picture of a highway sign pointing toward nearby state parks, but decades later, the blurred outline of the vehicle in the background became one of the last known visual confirmations. Investigators enlarged it, circled it in red ink, scrutinized the shape of the roof rack. It was them. The picture was both comforting and devastating, proof of life, but also a reminder that after this, the trail grew thin. At a rest stop, a vending machine vendor later recalled seeing children who matched their description. He remembered because one of them struggled with the coin slot, shaking the machine until a candy bar fell out. The vendor even laughed about it at the time, a small act of mischief from kids on a road trip. But in later interviews, his laughter turned brittle. He couldn't remember exactly which day it had been, nor could he say with absolute certainty that it was the same family. Memory plays tricks, especially when investigators return to you with photographs and ask, could it have been them? His uncertainty became another shadow, another possible candle that may or may not have been theirs. What stands out in these last sightings is how unremarkable they seemed at the time. A wave from the driveway. A brief stop at a toll booth. A blurry car in a tourist's photograph. Children fussing with a vending machine. None of it felt like history, yet in retrospect, these fragments became the scaffolding upon which the entire investigation rested. Ordinary moments turned into sacred relics, dissected in police reports, repeated in documentaries, whispered about in town halls. Each detail mattered, and each detail was desperately insufficient. Then came the gas station. Several witnesses swore they saw the family there, late afternoon, the sun beginning to dip low enough to stretch shadows across the concrete. The children stretched their legs beside the car, the mother stood by the passenger door, the father filled the tank. Everything appeared ordinary, just another stop along the way. This would later become a fulcrum in the story, the last moment anyone could say with conviction that the family was still present in the physical world. After that, silence. When their relatives tried to reconstruct the timeline, they pored over these sightings again and again, as though repetition might break open the truth. But repetition only made the silence heavier. The clock ticked forward, but no new witnesses emerged, no additional photographs surfaced, no phone calls arrived. It was as if the road itself had swallowed them whole. This is the cruel paradox of vanishings. The more you examine the last known details, the more they expand into obsession. A horn honked at the curb becomes a farewell loaded with premonition. A tired glance at a toll booth becomes a signal of hidden stress. A blurry car in a photograph becomes an entire family's final testimony. Memory and evidence merge until even the witnesses doubt what they saw. By the end of that day in 1983, the family should have been unpacking at their holiday lodging, tossing clothes onto beds, children running toward the pool. Instead, their trail ended somewhere between the gas station and the horizon. That gap, small in miles, immeasurable in grief, would become the space where theories flourished and hope withered. The gas station where the family was last remembered did not look like a place where stories began or ended. It stood alone on a stretch of highway that felt endless, surrounded by miles of dry fields broken only by the occasional tree bending in the wind. By 1983, its paint was already faded, the neon sign buzzing with a faint hum even in daylight. It was the kind of station travelers hardly noticed unless they needed to stop, halfway between one town and the next, a dot on the map that no one circled as a destination. Yet it would become the place history returned to again and again, the place where the trail of a family seemed to pause, flicker, and vanish. To describe the gas station is to describe liminality. Its cracked asphalt was marked with oil stains like bruises on concrete. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed above aisles of snacks that were more dust than sugar. A soda machine stood outside the entrance, its paint peeling, coins often stuck in its slot. The smell was a mix of gasoline, motor oil, and faintly spoiled coffee. On the horizon, the road shimmered in the heat, bending into mirages that made travelers squint. This was not a place people lingered, it was a place they passed through, a punctuation mark in a sentence too long. The attendant who worked there that day was young, barely in his 20s, though the job made him seem older. His days were carved into predictable routines, filling tanks, wiping windshields if asked, ringing up cigarettes and maps. To him, every customer looked similar: tired eyes behind sunglasses, families juggling snacks, solitary drivers speaking little. Yet even he noticed the strangeness of the isolation. The gas station stood in the middle of somewhere that felt like nowhere, a place where time stretched out, where minutes seemed heavier than in town. When the family arrived, they were not unusual. Their station wagon pulled up beside the pump, roof rack still strapped tight with luggage. The father stepped out first, careful with the nozzle, his eyes scanning the price on the meter. The mother opened her door, stretching her legs, her face turned toward the horizon as though gauging the distance left. The children spilled out, restless, tugging at each other, their laughter echoing in the still air. To the attendant, it was routine, another family in transit, another fleeting moment of life intersecting with his long day. But looking back, every detail of that stop became charged with meaning. The way the father leaned a little too long against the car. The way the mother glanced at the children with a mix of patience and worry. The way the youngest tugged at her sleeve, begging for candy from the store. The attendant remembered how the air seemed strangely heavy, though he could never later explain why. In the moment, it was nothing. In retrospect, it was everything. The geography of the place amplified the unease. Beyond the gas station stretched only highway and emptiness. Drivers who stopped there often felt the peculiar vulnerability of being far from towns, far from the safety of familiar streets. At night, the stars came down thick and close, but during the day, it was the sun that ruled, baking the ground and draining color from everything. It was a setting that seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for stories to unfold, as though swallowing them once they had. Investigators who later visited described it as unsettling. They walked the perimeter, searched the ditches, combed through the station's records. Yet the more they looked, the less they found. There were no broken-down cars nearby, no abandoned belongings, no signs of struggle. Just the memory of a stop, recalled by one attendant, and the impression it left on him years later. The gas station became less a location than a threshold, one of those invisible doorways where the ordinary gives way to the inexplicable. For the community, the gas station grew into a kind of haunted landmark. Travelers would slow down as they passed, glancing at it through their windows as though it might whisper something to them. Some swore they felt uneasy when they stopped there, as though echoes of that vanished family lingered in the air. Others avoided it altogether, unwilling to carry the weight of what it represented. Even after it closed years later, its skeletal structure stood against the sky, a relic of unanswered questions. It is strange how places become vessels of memory. A home, a school, a church, these are expected repositories of human life. But a lonely gas station, halfway to nowhere, should have been forgettable. Instead, it became infamous, cemented into the timeline of a story that refused to close. The family filled their tank, the children stretched their legs, and then, nothing. That patch of cracked asphalt was the last confirmed piece of ground they ever touched. The power of that place lies not in what happened there, but in what might have. Did someone follow them from that station? Did a stranger notice them there for reasons unknown? Did something within the family itself surface in that moment, attention no one else could see? Or was it merely an ordinary stop, later stained with significance only because it was the last one? The station cannot answer. It stands mute, holding only the weight of memory and speculation. And so, the story of the family intersects forever with the story of that gas station, a forgotten outpost that became a monument to mystery. On that hot afternoon in 1983, its neon lights flickered, its pumps clicked, its cash register rang. Nothing seemed unusual. Yet history would return again and again to that lonely spot, circling it like a wound that never healed, because somewhere beyond its perimeter, the family was swallowed by silence. When investigators first questioned the gas station attendant, his account seemed as ordinary as the stop itself. He told them the family had arrived in a station wagon, roof rack piled high with luggage, the father stepping out first to pump gas. The man had paid in cash, bills folded neatly, passed across the counter without hesitation. Nothing about the transaction had felt unusual. The attendant recalled the children waiting beside the car, fidgeting as children do when road trips stretch too long. The mother had entered the store briefly, buying a bottle of soda and a packet of gum. These details, mundane in every way, were logged into police reports as though they might one day yield revelation. At the time, they seemed only to confirm that the family had indeed passed through. He remembered the father as polite but preoccupied. When asked later if he had noticed stress, anger, or fear, the attendant shook his head. The man's eyes might have carried the tiredness of long-distance driving, but nothing more. The mother had smiled faintly at him when she handed over change for her purchase. He said she seemed like any woman traveling with children, caught between patience and fatigue. The children had not spoken to him directly, but their voices carried through the open car windows, playful, restless, a little loud. The youngest asked repeatedly for candy, and the mother's voice, warm but firm, replied no. There was nothing about this exchange that seemed destined for the history books. That was what haunted the investigators most, the ordinariness. For those hoping to find a clue, the attendant's description was frustratingly bland. There were no strangers lurking near the pumps, no arguments overheard, no sudden departures that could be called suspicious. The family appeared as any family might appear at a gas station, one stop among many on a road that promised holiday and rest. This very lack of distinction was, paradoxically, what made the testimony powerful. If a family could vanish after a moment so ordinary, it suggested that disappearance could bloom anywhere, even in the most predictable places. The attendant's words were repeated again and again in interviews. Each time, reporters leaned in, hoping to catch some overlooked detail. Did the father's tone suggest worry? Was the mother nervous? Did the children seem unusually quiet? Each time, the attendant insisted, no. They had been a family on the road, tired but fine. They had paid, filled their tank, and left. Nothing more. Yet the more he repeated the story, the more the ordinariness began to carry weight. The way he described the soda bottle sweating in the mother's hand, the sound of the nozzle clicking when the tank was full, the faint jingle of the bell above the store door, all of these details took on a cinematic sharpness, as though memory itself was trying to tell him these fragments mattered. Memory, however, is not always faithful. It can inflate the insignificant and blur the essential. Still, these fragments were all that remained. Investigators scoured the station, hoping to find corroborating evidence. Receipts confirmed the purchase of gas and gum. Tire tracks in the dust behind the pumps could have belonged to their car, but so could they have belonged to 100 others. Security cameras, still rare in rural outposts at that time, offered nothing. It was the attendant's testimony alone that placed the family there, his recollection becoming the foundation of the timeline. His words, steady and consistent, were the last bridge between the family's presence and their disappearance. What is striking, looking back, is how everyone wanted his memory to yield more than it could. They wanted a gesture, a glance, a muttered word that might explain the unexplainable. But all he could give them was routine, cash changing hands, children squabbling, a mother buying gum. If truth hides in details, then these were all the details he had. And if truth does not, then the silence that followed was even more crushing. For the attendant, his first statement was almost casual, another day logged in the monotony of his work. He could not have known, standing there beneath humming fluorescent lights, that his words would be picked apart for decades to come. He did not know he was becoming a character in a story that would define the rest of his life. At that moment, it was just another shift, another family, another stop along a highway that ran endlessly in both directions. And yet, in hindsight, this unremarkable statement is chilling. Because it marks the final time the family is anchored in certainty. After they pulled away from that gas station, the record goes silent. No more receipts, no more photographs, no more witnesses whose memory could be relied upon. The world closed in around them, and they disappeared into the wide, unknowable space beyond. The attendant's first statement is a reminder of how fragile the line between ordinary and extraordinary truly is. What seemed forgettable at the time became unforgettable in retrospect. A bottle of soda, a packet of gum, a tank of gas, objects that meant nothing more than convenience in the moment, turned into relics of a final sighting. They were the last gestures of a family alive in the world, preserved only because someone happened to notice them in passing. And then they were gone. The moment the family failed to arrive at their holiday destination, worry spread slowly, like a drop of ink across water. At first, relatives tried to keep calm. Cars broke down, after all. Road trips ran late. Maybe they had stopped at a motel, the children too tired to continue. But when phone calls to lodgings went unanswered, when friends waiting to meet them received no sign, the ink spread further. Concern turned into alarm, and alarm into dread. By the time police were formally notified, days had already passed, and the trail was already cooling beneath the summer sun. The first search efforts were practical, almost mechanical. Officers retraced the known route, checking rest stops, motels, roadside diners. Patrol cars cruised along the stretches of highway where the family was last believed to have traveled, eyes sharp for signs of a vehicle abandoned in a ditch or parked along the shoulder. Helicopters joined in, their blades beating the hot air, sweeping over forests and rivers that edged the road. From above, they scanned for flashes of metal, the telltale glint of a car roof hidden beneath trees. Nothing appeared. The earth seemed too silent, too empty, as if it had already swallowed the evidence whole. As days stretched into weeks, volunteers arrived, driven by empathy, curiosity, or fear. Neighbors walked shoulder to shoulder through fields, their boots kicking up dust and insects. Some carried flashlights even during daylight, poking into culverts, drainage pipes, the edges of abandoned barns. Others scoured picnic areas, peering beneath tables, behind dumpsters, anywhere a clue might linger. Each search ended the same way, with exhaustion, with silence, with no trace of a family who had vanished between 1 mile marker and the next. The absence began to seep into the psyche of the town. Parents found themselves gripping their children's hands more tightly at grocery stores, locking doors earlier at night. Teenagers whispered about what might have happened, inventing theories both wild and grim. Some believed the family had been victims of a roadside predator. Others insisted they had staged their disappearance, that perhaps they wanted to leave everything behind. The lack of evidence became fertile ground for rumor, and rumor bred unease. Police, meanwhile, tried to remain composed. Their reports stacked higher, pages filled with leads that led nowhere. They interviewed truck drivers who had passed through the area, though few remembered more than the blur of the highway. They questioned motel clerks, gas station attendants, store owners, each one offering fragments that never assembled into a whole. A handful of tips suggested sightings in neighboring towns, but none could be confirmed. Some were the product of confused memory, others seemed born from imagination. Hope would flare for a moment, then collapse again, leaving only ash. The searches grew more desperate. Dogs were brought in to follow scent trails, but the open road offered nothing for them to hold on to. Divers checked rivers that snaked beneath highway bridges, searching for a vehicle submerged in dark water. Fields were combed again, this time more slowly, as though determination might reveal what patience had missed. But still, the land gave nothing. Every ditch, every grove of trees, every shadow seemed to mock the searchers. It was as if the family had been lifted cleanly from the surface of the earth, leaving no indentation behind. What lingers in accounts of those weeks is not only the futility of the searches but the emotional weight they placed on those who took part. Officers later confessed to sleepless nights, lying awake replaying routes in their heads, convinced they must have overlooked something. Volunteers described the eerie sensation of scanning an open field, knowing that somewhere in the grass might lie the answer, yet seeing only emptiness. For many, the search for the family became a personal haunting, an unfinished task they carried long after the case went cold. The community grew restless under the weight of silence. Local newspapers published updates daily, though there was rarely anything new to report. Each headline repeated the same words, missing, vanished, mystery, until they became a chorus echoing through town. Churches held vigils where candles flickered like fragile beacons, prayers rising into the night air. Parents exchanged nervous glances in pews, silently wondering if their own children might someday vanish as easily. Even as the official search scaled back, the memory of it clung to everyone involved. The helicopters, the search dogs, the endless lines of volunteers, all of it amounted to nothing but the reminder of absence. The family's car was not found on the side of the road. Their belongings were not scattered in a ditch. Their bodies were not discovered in the fields. They had simply ceased to be seen, and no amount of human effort could redraw their presence. Absence has a way of becoming louder than presence. In the months that followed, the town no longer looked at the highway as a ribbon of freedom but as a scar running through the land. Every passing car carried with it the possibility of danger. Every silence stretched too long, every phone unanswered too quickly, became a cause for alarm. The disappearance had turned ordinary life into something fragile, and the people who searched carried that fragility with them long after their boots left the dust. The searches yielded nothing, and perhaps that was the most terrifying answer of all. Because in that nothingness lay infinite possibilities, each one darker than the last. The family was not found, but neither were they explained. They were suspended in absence, a puzzle with pieces missing, leaving behind only the echo of those desperate weeks when dozens of hands reached into the void and came back empty. Years passed before the gas station attendant admitted that his memory of the family's stop had changed. or perhaps, as he often put it, become clearer. At first, investigators assumed this was a simple case of a witness revising details under pressure, but the story he told was not a collection of harmless corrections. It was something heavier, something that unsettled everyone who heard it. His recollections, sharpened by time and guilt, gave the family's last known moments an entirely different texture. He confessed that when he first saw them, the atmosphere around the car hadn't felt quite as light-hearted as he originally claimed. The father, he now remembered, carried a stiffness in his posture, leaning against the car as though bracing himself. His voice, when he spoke to his wife, was low, almost inaudible, but sharp enough that the tone lodged itself in the attendant's memory. The mother, standing near the rear of the vehicle, kept glancing toward the children as if urging them to stay close. The laughter of the youngest, which the attendant once recalled as playful noise, now came back to him as forced, a bright sound trying to cut through tension. Most troubling of all was the detail he had not mentioned in his original statement: another car. He described it as a dark sedan, pulling into the station just after the family arrived. At the time, he thought nothing of it. Travelers came and went constantly, cars stopping in sequence was not unusual. But what pressed on his memory, years later, was how closely the sedan had followed them in. The driver remained inside, engine idling, eyes hidden behind sunglasses. The attendant recalled glancing at him, waiting for him to exit, but he never did. He simply sat there, watching. The family seemed aware of this presence too. The father, while pretending to focus on the gas pump, kept glancing in the sedan's direction. The mother's grip on her children grew tighter whenever they strayed too close to the rear of the car. The eldest child even tugged at his father's sleeve once, whispering something urgent. These details were faint, fragments that had blurred in the attendant's memory for decades, but they resurfaced like ghosts when he was older, perhaps softened by the passage of time, or sharpened by his own inability to forget. Investigators did not know how to treat this revised testimony. Memory is a slippery thing, shaped not only by experience but by fear, suggestion, even the act of remembering itself. Yet there was something in the attendant's voice when he spoke of it, something trembling, something wounded, that suggested he believed it. And belief, even without proof, can be enough to reshape the story. For the families of the missing, the revelation was unbearable. The idea that someone might have been following, watching, circling the edges of their final hours, it cracked open new chambers of grief. If another car had indeed shadowed them, then perhaps the disappearance was not random. Perhaps it had been orchestrated, deliberate, cruelly precise. And if the attendant had remembered this earlier, if he had spoken of it at the time, would the trail have been fresher? Would the search have narrowed instead of sprawling endlessly into nothing? Such questions carved wounds that never closed. The attendant, for his part, seemed consumed by regret. He admitted that something about the family's stop had unsettled him even in that moment, though he could not have said why. A prickle at the back of his neck, a heaviness in his chest, the sense that he was witnessing something fragile on the verge of breaking. But he buried those instincts. He told himself it was just another family, just another car. Only later did he realize how much weight silence can carry. The community listened to his account with unease. Some believed him, convinced that memory sharpened under the pressure of guilt can uncover truths buried deep. Others dismissed it, arguing that years of rumors and speculation had seeped into his recollections, reshaping them into a narrative that fit too neatly with suspicion. Either way, his words ensured that the story of the family's last moments at the gas station could never again be viewed as ordinary. What once seemed like a simple stop for fuel now carried an atmosphere of dread, a shadow that stretched long across the decades. The image of that second car, its engine idling, its driver silent and watching, became a symbol of menace. It was a detail too vivid to ignore, too vague to pursue. Investigators searched old records, looking for vehicles registered in the area that might match, but decades had eroded paper trails. Witnesses from that day could not, or would not, confirm the presence of another car. And so the dark sedan remained half-real, lodged somewhere between truth and rumor, between memory and imagination. Still, the attendant's confession reshaped everything. What had once been a story of absence became a story of presence, a silent presence that loomed behind the family in their final hours. His words added a layer of dread, the sense that the family's fate had not been random but perhaps written before they even left the station. It made the silence that followed all the more unbearable, as though the mystery were not simply about where they had gone, but who had been waiting for them along the road. And as the attendant grew older, his memories took on the quality of a haunting. He admitted he often woke in the night, hearing the echo of the car engine idling, seeing again the father's glance over his shoulder, the mother's hand pressing down on her children's shoulders. Memory blurred into nightmare, but nightmare, he insisted, was only memory amplified. His words became the hinge upon which the story of the family swung, from ordinary disappearance to chilling enigma. After the gas station, the family's trail disappears into the open road, a stretch of asphalt that stretches long and straight under the heat of the sun, indifferent to human presence. The landscape beyond that stop was unremarkable in the way that empty highways often are, fields of golden grass stretching toward low hills, forests that marked the horizon, occasional signs advertising diners or small motels. To the casual traveler, it was a road to be driven, a corridor between points A and B. To investigators and those left behind, it became a corridor to nowhere, a space where certainty ended and questions multiplied. This section of highway, hundreds of miles of it, was scoured repeatedly, yet it yielded nothing. There were no skid marks suggesting a sudden accident, no abandoned belongings hinting at a struggle, no abandoned car hiding in some side road. Helicopters flew overhead, their shadows flicking across fields and forests, but even from the air, nothing distinguished this stretch from any other. It was as if the family had vanished mid-journey, leaving only the memory of their laughter and movement behind. The emptiness of the road itself became almost metaphorical. Highways are usually symbols of motion, of connection, of progress. But here, the road seemed to embody stillness and loss. Travelers passing by in later years would report an inexplicable unease, the sensation that this stretch of highway was waiting, silently observing, hiding something just beyond perception. Investigators later described driving it over and over, a monotonous gray ribbon under an indifferent sky, until even the landscape seemed complicit in the disappearance. Theories began to take shape as the road swallowed certainty. Some suggested an accident, an unnoticed turn into a ditch, a miscalculated curve. But the landscape offered no clues. There were no natural hazards that could have caused a sudden disappearance, no cliffs or rivers in the immediate area. Others proposed foul play, a shadowy figure, someone lying in wait, perhaps connected to the sedan that had been observed at the gas station. Yet there was no evidence, only suspicion, and the very lack of signs made the idea both plausible and impossible at once. Travelers who passed through decades later described an almost palpable tension along that stretch. Stories circulated of children looking out the windows, suddenly quiet as though sensing something unspoken, or of adults feeling a sudden chill in the midday heat. The road became a vessel for anxiety, a place where ordinary journeys became interlaced with the memory of those who had vanished. Every mile was a question mark, every curve an invitation for the mind to fill in the blanks with fear. The psychological impact on investigators was profound. They retraced the highway countless times, driving slowly, scanning every rest stop, every grove, every turnoff. Days blurred into nights. Officers described the road as empty, but heavy, as if it carried a weight that could not be measured by tire tracks or mileage. Some admitted that, after repeated trips, they began to doubt their senses, imagining movement where there was none, seeing the shape of a car in fields that held only grass and wildflowers. Even those trained to observe and analyze were affected by the quiet magnitude of the highway's emptiness. It was along this road that hope and fear intertwined. The absence of evidence became a canvas for imagination, fertile ground for theories both rational and chilling. Did the family drive off into some hidden turnoff, unseen by all? Was someone following them, guiding them into some trap? Or had they simply disappeared into thin air, swallowed by the road itself? The lack of concrete answers made the mystery more sinister. It was no longer a disappearance but a void, a nothingness that seemed to stretch infinitely. For the families left behind, this section of highway became symbolic of everything lost. It represented the gap between certainty and the unknowable, the distance that could never be measured, the journey that could never be completed. In photographs and maps, it was just a line between points, but in memory and imagination, it became a liminal space, a threshold between presence and absence. Each mile driven by relatives or investigators was a silent plea, a search for the missing, a hope that the road might return them. Even decades later, the highway retains its haunting reputation. Locals still speak of it in hushed tones, travelers mention the weight in the air, the sense that someone, or something, could be watching. The road, in its vast ordinariness, has been transformed into a monument to absence, a place where motion ceases to mean anything, where time and distance become unreliable witnesses. It is here, in the void of nothingness and the expanse of emptiness, that the family's disappearance lingers most vividly, unclaimed by history, untethered from explanation, and forever suspended between what was and what might have been. The disappearance of the family did not end with the failure of the search. In the weeks, months, and years that followed, their absence rippled through the town and beyond, shaping lives in ways that no one could have anticipated. For relatives, every phone call, every holiday, every birthday became a reminder of what had been lost. Letters went unanswered, homes remained empty, and the family's bedroom furniture sat frozen in time, dust gathering over beds that would never be slept in again. Grief, in its most persistent form, took root not in sudden moments of sorrow but in the quiet, everyday reminders that they were gone. Neighbors carried their own weight. Parents watched their children with a vigilance that had once seemed excessive. Even casual walks down the street were colored with an undercurrent of unease. The ordinary rhythm of life, the morning coffee, the sound of children playing outside, the turning of seasons, was punctuated by the memory of what had vanished. People who had known the family well replayed moments in their minds, the mother waving goodbye from the driveway, the father's steady hands adjusting a rearview mirror, the children's laughter spilling into the yard. Each recollection was a mixture of warmth and pain, a reminder that life had once been normal and now was irrevocably altered. Former investigators and volunteers also bore invisible scars. They admitted to sleepless nights, restless in bed as they imagined the family somewhere, perhaps alive, perhaps in danger, perhaps already gone. Even those who had moved on professionally found themselves thinking of the highway, the gas station, the empty fields, long after the search officially ended. For them, the disappearance became a lingering ghost, a question that could never be fully answered, and a responsibility that could never be abandoned. Children of the town grew up with the story as a sort of unspoken lesson, that even ordinary families could vanish, that life could turn inexplicably dark. They whispered about it in schoolyards, speculating on what might have happened, inventing their own theories from fragments of rumor and imagination. Even years later, they would recall the sense of unease the story instilled, a shadow hovering over road trips and vacations, a reminder that safety and innocence are fragile, easily disrupted by forces unseen. Community events were tinged with the disappearance. Local media occasionally revisited the story, reminding residents of the unresolved mystery. Church vigils and memorial gatherings were held, not just for the family but for the collective fear and grief the incident had stirred. Candles flickered in windows and small gatherings became spaces where the community tried to contain the weight of absence, as if by commemorating it, they could somehow prevent it from spreading further. Even decades later, the town remembered the missing family as if they were frozen in time. Photographs were displayed at local historical societies, faded yet potent reminders of lives interrupted. Friends and extended family often spoke of them in the present tense, refusing to let memory convert into past tense. It was a way of holding on to hope, or perhaps simply refusing to accept the emptiness that reality imposed. Every anecdote, every remembered smile or laugh, became a fragile bridge across time, connecting the living to the vanished. Psychologically, the disappearance left a lingering unease in those who had been closest to the events. The idea that someone could vanish completely, without trace or explanation, gnawed at their sense of safety and normalcy. It reshaped their expectations of the world. Familiar roads became threatening, strangers became objects of suspicion, and ordinary days could feel precarious. The town, once comfortable in its rhythms, carried a subtle tension that persisted in conversations, in gestures, in the very way people moved through the streets. There was also a collective guilt that haunted many. People wondered if they could have noticed something earlier, done something differently, or intervened before it was too late. These questions were never answered, leaving emotional scars that were as real and heavy as physical absence. The weight of what IFS pressed upon neighbors, family members, and even casual acquaintances who had interacted with the family. Everyone felt, in some measure, a small responsibility for the unfolding mystery. Ultimately, the echoes of the disappearance extended far beyond those directly involved. It became part of the fabric of the community, shaping identity, memory, and daily life. Every summer brought reminders of vacations, every highway trip reminded parents of the missing children, every roadside rest stop became a place to pause in thought. Absence, it seemed, had become the family's enduring presence. They were everywhere and nowhere at once, woven into the emotional landscape of a town that refused to let them be forgotten. Even decades after the family vanished, fragments of their story continued to surface in ways both tantalizing and unsettling. Nothing ever offered definitive answers, but small, ambiguous discoveries kept the mystery alive, haunting investigators, relatives, and townspeople alike. It began with an unclaimed suitcase found in a dumpster at a small rest stop, miles from the family's last confirmed location. Its exterior was worn, covered in dust and rain stains, and the lock was broken, as though it had been forced open long ago. Inside, there were clothes that could have belonged to anyone, a child's worn toy, and a few personal items that seemed too generic to confirm a connection, but the timing and location made investigators pause. Could this suitcase be a breadcrumb in the trail that had gone cold for so many years? Or was it simply the accidental discarding of someone else's belongings, mistaken for significance because